So, ladies and gentlemen, as we have limited time for these breakout panels, I'm going to start and let our third panelist work his way onto stage while I say some words of introduction. I'm Robin Niblett, the director of Chatham House. We are delighted to be one of the strategic partners of the forum this year, and particularly pleased to have the opportunity to bring together this discussion on technology and the challenges of global governance. I could add in a multipolar world at the end, given the theme of the overall forum this year, and I think it will be an important element for our conversation today. At Chatham House, we've been running for a couple of years now a digital society initiative which seeks to bring together and to coordinate in a networked way all the different aspects in which technology is influencing public policy. And as a policy institute, like some of the others represented here at the forum, I think we're all finding that technology is not something you can keep in one basket on one side of your research agenda. It flows through everything, which poses particular challenges for organizations that are, like many organizations, have a certain amount of stovepiping in them. But what we're going to try to do today is, within 45 minutes, or 50 minutes, which is the amount of time we have, given the very packed agenda for the forum and the plenary sessions that will follow, what we want to do is just, get a sense from four very, I think, different perspectives, hopefully, though, coming together by the end of this panel, four very different perspectives of where technology governance is today. We have people who live it and are living it through various different sectors and lenses. Many of you in the audience will have your own perspectives, and I do want to save some 10 minutes or so up, at least at the end, to be able to get comments or questions from you. So please have some thoughts and questions in your mind. And I suppose the driving theme of this panel is the fact that we have progress taking place in the digital world at a lightning speed across all sorts of sectors: industrial, services, security, and in its interaction with people's lives, from the political to the social to the economic. And yet government, which has always been a little slow in keeping up with technological developments. Anyone in government, I'm sure, would be comfortable to recognize that. But the gap between governance and technological development just seems to keep widening all of the time. And I think the question for this panel is there a different way of doing things in terms of governance from the sorts that we've had before? I'm sure we will touch on issues of how to protect and yet make the most of data, how to protect privacy in that process. I'm sure we'll tackle the issue of cybercrime and cyber attacks. I'm sure we will touch on the issues of economic inclusion that technology permits and which over-governance might restrict. And of course, I'm sure we'll touch on the issue of ethical standards as well, and to what extent, given the way technology permeates all aspects of life, must it have norms, or must its development and use be following certain normative structures? And that's why, to close my introduction, it brings us into this wonderful multipolar world bit, because it's not as if all of the world has the same perspective on what the right normative structures should be. We'll come to that in a minute. Our panel is very well placed to cover this. Dr. Hessa Sultan Al-Jaber on my left, who is the Minister for Information and Communications Technology of Qatar, and was. Well, you're now doing, you've had that, and you've had the role, I wanted to mention earlier, of somebody who's on the Supreme Council for a long time. Now on the board, or still on the board, of Sat and Jubi Health, and a member of the Consultative Assembly of the Majlis. But somebody who brings direct government experience of this issue. We have Fabrizio Hochschild Drummond, now Under Secretary General at the United Nations, where he's helping the Secretary General prepare for the 75th anniversary of the UN next year, but was until very recently the Assistant Secretary General for Strategic Coordination. and we'll be able to talk about some of the very important work the UN has been doing in this space. Mary Snapp, who is Vice President of Strategic Initiatives in the Corporate External Legal Affairs Department of Microsoft, somebody intimately involved also in the Microsoft Foundation, and who is obviously at the cutting edge of how one of these companies that is ubiquitous in the value it brings to technology in the economy, must also cope with this very complicated regulatory environment. And Paddy McGuinness, at the end of our panel there, now a senior advisor to Brunswick, former deputy national security advisor in the Cabinet Office in the UK for intelligence, security and resilience, a position he held until 2018 and formerly with the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. So a very well situated panel. And let me start with you, as you're immediately on my left, Dr. Hessa, if I could just bring you into this conversation. You've been involved through most of your career until very recently with making sure that Qatar has the right digital infrastructure to be able to grow at the rapid pace it has grown so far. And I suppose, from my point of view, I'm wondering to what extent is technology absolutely central to, and has it been central to Qatar's development? And have you found that there are governance gaps in the way that the technologies that you're using are affecting Qatar's ability to use it for national economic development? Would it be helpful for you if there were more formal international rules on privacy, or even on taxation for that matter, or on any aspects? Are you worried that Qatar is bringing in a digital infrastructure to Qatar's development that might later on not be in sync with a new global governance set of arrangements? I'm just wondering how you see the potential gap between technology governance and Qatar's own technology infrastructure development.
I think when it comes to Qatar, I think it will be really hard not to discuss privacy and all the foundation that we had built. Especially, I'm having a member of my old team who had built very strong infrastructure, and the fact that last week we had signed big agreement with Microsoft, so we are having now our own that branded by Microsoft cloud. I think it's only shows that 100% Qatar is part of the full integrated when it comes to the infrastructure. I think I just like to highlight one important point, which is related to privacy versus the shared data for the public good. I think, and this is something I always had issue with that. We are in the government, or we always debate about how can we, how can our personal data be protected against risk of misuse? In the same time, how can our personal data could be used for the goodwill of the country? And it's clear that data should be used and it should be shared, but government should be very critical about 3 points when it comes to the user privacy. It is security, user right, and consent. When I said security, government or private sector should make sure that data will be stored in a secure place like Microsoft Azure, and 100% government should put cybersecurity at the top of their agenda, because cyber security breach will cost, and it is costing all government a lot, and the estimation that it will be in 2021 around 6 billion. That's the cost of cybersecurity breach. The second thing that is very critical, it's the user right, and I think if I will put my data if I will put my private data on any data center, I would like to have my user right in it. And here I'd like to quote something that I find it very critical. I think user should have their data right, giving to user authority over their data. Their right can be quite powerful. They can offer the right to access, right to delete, right to change, and I think this is where governance should come also. User should give a consent when any other company will be using their data. I know now whenever we will go and open a website, you will find the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, where they will ask you, there will be cookie where they will ask you to store or whatever, and all of us, we will just go and click yes. I think as an individual, we should have the right to understand where is this data will be stored. So I think when it comes to governance, for me, there are so many issues for the governance, but one of the critical things is the privacy versus the public use of the data.
And just to follow up on one question on this, so you emphasize so much the importance of privacy as one of the areas for governance, and you say, therefore, it's got to be stored and protected. Does the government of Qatar insist that its citizens' data must be stored somehow within the sovereign space of Qatar, or are you comfortable, as some governments are, with that data being stored by Microsoft or whomever, wherever they need to store it in order to be able to use it? Where does a country like Qatar stand on that dynamic?
Yeah, for now, and Khalid in front of me, I work with a small startup in health, and it was very clear that all privacy, all health data should be stored in Qatar. So, but my assumption with Microsoft now and with the cloud, things will be different. But up to now, all data should be stored 100% in Qatar.
But so what you're saying is you may be relaxing that approach.
My assumption, we should relax.
There's a nodding in the front row. So but that's interesting, because that's almost going against the grain, one might say, of some attitudes of some countries, which is to pull more inside the border. But we'll come back to how one then manages this with requirements for privacy. Let me bring Fabrizio in, please. Fabrizio, the UN undertook a really elaborate approach on this high-level panel on digital cooperation, which was reported out, I think, in June. You've had at least 15 years of the Internet Governance Forum operating under UN auspices, so the UN has seen this as a critical area for future governance, and we heard earlier today from the President of the UN General Assembly how important its role is for smaller states in particular to feel they have a voice. Could you just share with us and for the audience here some of the main conclusions that you're taking forward from that panel?
Thank you. The Secretary General convoked the panel as the digital issue has taken the world by storm. And as you pointed out, there's a very serious pacing problem between the pace at which the technology has spread. Never has a technology spread at that speed across the world. It took about 60 years for electricity to reach its first 50 million users. It's taken just 25 years for digital technology to reach half of the world, 3.7 billion people. And governments, policymakers have had a hard time keeping up. And of course, many aspects of governance are national, some are regional, but in a technology that by definition does not recognize borders, there is inevitably an international element. And the purpose of the Secretary General's high-level panel was to advise on how to make the best use of these technologies to ensure that they would really promote sustainable development, how to curtail unintended consequences and malicious uses. And the panel made a series of recommendations under a number of headings. First was related to inclusion. At the moment, there's a very important digital divide. About 53% of the world has access to the internet, but that's not equal between men and women, surprisingly, even in the 21st century. 10% less access globally for women, and in developing countries, it's up to 30% access less for women. And then in the least developed countries, the 47 least developed countries, the internet access is less than 20%. In the place I served in before coming to New York, Central African Republic, there was only about 6% access to the internet. So in a world where healthcare, education, the economy is more and more driven by digital means, the absence of access in so many places and to so many communities means being left behind. So the first set of recommendations of the panel were about measures that should be undertaken to ensure that there's universal, affordable access by 2030, and the capacities is built up in countries that need it where required. The second set of recommendations were around containing harms. The internet has brought massive benefits, but it has also allowed for the unprecedented spread of hate speech. It has allowed for the undermining of elections. It has allowed for a whole new form of crime, with the criminal actor very far removed from the crime scene, and it's undermined social cohesion. So greater measures need to be undertaken, both to uphold human rights in the digital era, but also to enforce them and to ensure that there's better understanding of how they apply. And there's a set of recommendations around that. And then there are recommendations around trust and security. When aircraft were introduced in the First World War, for the first time in centuries, there was a whole new domain of warfare. Well, the invention of the internet has created another new domain for conflict, for violence, and that needs to be better regulated. And that applies both for interstate conflict as well as acts by non-state actors and criminal violations. So there are a set of recommendations about how to improve digital trust and security. And finally, to uphold the good of the internet and curtail the bad, there is a need for international cooperation. There are some examples in the UN, but they're not to the scale of the problem. And the report also makes recommendations about how these could be improved. So that in sum is the report. It's online. It's called The Age of Digital Interdependence, and I would warmly recommend it to all.
And which of those, you're not going to go through every recommendation over here, obviously here there are a lot in the paper itself, but if you were to pick out one in which you feel most progress has been made, and the one which is most urgent that there should be progress made, but it hasn't, in a nutshell, could you give one of each?
I think an area where more and more progress is being made is in explaining how human rights apply online and interpreting existing human rights norms that were drafted in a pre-digital era, interpreting their application for the digital era. And there's a lot of work going on. More needs to be done to make that work more broadly known, but there's a tremendous amount of work already done. And of course, there need to be accountability mechanisms to uphold those rights online. So that's an area where I think there's good progress, even though more can be done. I think where greater progress is needed is really in promoting cyber stability, digital trust, and security. And again, there's in the specific area of threats to international peace and security under the first committee of the General Assembly, there's important work just having been initiated in a group of experts, building on work done in the past in other groups of experts, and in an open-ended working group on digital and threats to international peace and security. But of course, the threats to security are much broader than just interstate. And that's an area where much more work needs to be done. I think there's a real risk of of ever more security violations, data breaches, threats in one way or another, and I don't think what has been done at an international level is yet sufficient to deal with the ever-growing reality and threat.
Thank you for that point, Fabrizio, also because it lets me actually do an unintended but good segue to Paddy. So I do want to bring one more perspective into this. Paddy, I think you were involved in an effort by the UK government a good 4 or 5 years ago to bring together governments from around the world, China, India, US, Russia, all to talk about cybersecurity, thinking about new norms, new processes. And I'm just wondering how much progress you think has been made since that time. We're hearing from Fabrizio, it's the one area that he's, well, one of the areas in which he's most concerned about progress not being made. What's happened? What could be done? What's your reading of the resilience part, which was in your title in government, internationally?
Robin, thank you very much. Not much progress has been made on international norms. Many are advocating them, but perhaps as a result of the crisis in international diplomacy and consensus, or perhaps because of the particular nature of the cyber domain, states do not seem willing to enter into the kind of constraint that, for instance, they were willing to enter into about other causes of difficulties, such as, I don't know, extreme weapons after the First World War, chemical and biological weapons, for example. And I use that example quite deliberately. Now, I think states aren't doing that in part because they don't fully understand this domain, and frankly because there continues to be, in all states, not only those who are often called out as the most threatening and active, an appetite for having offensive cyber capability, and that puts a constraint upon diplomacy, that they wish to keep options in the domain open to have deterrent capability in this space because they fear the intention of others, even if they introduce norms. They simply do not trust others, and they do not have sufficient verification. There have been arrangements between states, and I myself was involved in the negotiation of the UK-China cyber agreement, which followed on from an Obama-era US-China. I would say that these agreements have had Darwinian effect, in that the things that we could see that led to us asking for an agreement we no longer see, but that is not to say there is no longer cyber activity of great concern emanating from actors we would say probably were Chinese, for instance. So I think we just need to have that in mind. That said, something really as important is happening in the resilience sphere, and I'm glad you asked me that, Robin, because it allows me to get into something really important, it seems to me. So at the moment, many enterprises and many states, frankly, particularly those in the global south with perhaps less technological capability built into their societies and their states, are wide open to a whole range of pernicious cyber activity, cyber attacks. And that has profound consequences for us all. One of the most powerful things we can do in this international norms space, in this governance space, is to drive up the cost of entry. If it is possible for a state, any state, to act against another, and this region has not been immune from this phenomenon, using very basic tools, because there simply is not the resilience built into the networks, the data that is being attacked, then it's very hard to call out a state actor or a non-state actor for doing that. And so if we get better within our networks and within our states at cyber security, such that we close down the length of time that an actor can be in our networks without cause, such that we have partnerships with corporations, and Microsoft are getting a lot of advertising today, but such as Microsoft, which is what we did incidentally in the WannaCry case, you can get to the point where you can begin to attribute and block. Attribute allows the kind of international action that, His Excellency Special Advisor might develop for us, or might promote the development of through all these frameworks. It also has the effect of stripping the hacker of their tools. There is nothing more miserable than a hacker with no tools. Just a couple of other quick thoughts about resilience. Resilience is complex. It doesn't lend itself to geographic thinking. Yeah? When I look at the attitude you often get in our political classes of wanting to lock down data and keep it in a physical space, maintaining your own physical space with your own defenses is nothing like as good as leveraging the technology spend of a large corporation such as Microsoft or the partnerships you have with another state. When we think about resilience and our responsibility for resilience, there's a responsibility obviously for a state, for your own networks in your state, and improving that constantly. But also, now in our interconnected world, each state, many states, are part of the critical national infrastructure of another state. When I was in office and I thought of Qatar and British energy supplies, Qatar supplies at any time between 20 and 30% of British natural gas. So Qatari infrastructure is absolutely critical to the availability and pricing of gas into the United Kingdom. There's a sense in which it's part of British CNI. So it seems to me that when we talk about these norms, there are all sorts of activities going on in partnership with corporations and nationally, by NGOs to fill out, and by companies to fill out the space that needs to be filled by these higher norms. It's going to take a while until we have consensus at state level to do that. In the meantime, we can raise the cost of entry through being resilient, through our partnerships, and critically, it seems to me, through our leadership within our nation states. That if you can integrate vertically within your state the effort to make it resilient, you have remarkable effect for yourselves and for your partners and allies.
Thank you for those points, and I'm sure we want to come back to one or two of them in the questions as well on the panel. Mary, private sector brought up there a couple of times by Paddy. You might want to just address a couple of his remarks about the need for partnership between governments and the private sector to deliver the security. It's not something governments can do alone. But we're also in a phase, maybe you could touch on this, where more and more technology companies are sort of demanding, or seem to be demanding, higher levels of government regulation. And of course, when they say that, they often mean ideally one standard across countries rather than lots of different types of regulation. Where does a company like Microsoft sit? Would you rather have, you know, a ubiquitous global standard like a GDPR? What is the nature of this demand that you're making, and are you getting it answered effectively by governments?
It's a complicated answer. So let me just sort of step back just a little bit. There just is no question that there are heightened expectations of corporations around the world today as a result of the fast pace at which technology has moved and its ability, as we've heard from the other panelists, to be treated sometimes as a weapon and not only just a tool. So we realize that there's heightened expectations across, and we know that this is a time, as Fabrizio said, where things are moving faster than they've ever been. But before we start talking about regulations, I think it's really important to talk about principles. And when you talk about principles, whether you're talking about principles related to privacy, whether you're talking about the principles that you care the most about related to artificial intelligence and the ethics associated with that, whether you're talking about the principles for inclusive technology and whether that means women or whether that means people with disabilities, and whether you're talking about principles related to how to keep people safe in an online environment, whether it's from extremist content or whether it's from hacking. If you can get some agreement on those principles, then I think you can start to talk about regulation. And so I think what we have done at Microsoft is really focused on these principles related to, for example, AI and ethics, principles around fairness against unconscious bias. Certainly reliability and security are part of that. Privacy is part of that. Inclusivity is part of that. But a key part of that is accountability, to ensure that there is human decision-making, no matter what kind of artificial intelligence we're talking about, if it is something that really impacts against those basic principles. So what I would say is, to be just really candid, no one has elected Microsoft to a public office. And so it is really critical as we start to talk about these principles to engage with governments in a collaborative way to talk about the best way to drive the technology forward. We say often within my group at Microsoft that technology shouldn't proceed faster than the speed of thought. And we need to work in a collaborative manner, both with our competitive partners in some of these areas, like online terrorist content, and we need to work with our government partners as well. I think we in the technology world has sometimes not given enough credit to government leaders for understanding technology. I think this panel demonstrates that government leaders certainly do understand the technology, and it's time for us as technologists to work side by side with some of these critical issues. We are at a different time. This is not like collaborating on intellectual property. This is not like collaborating on competition law. This is a full step forward in terms of technology and innovation and the impact that it can have on the world, and a technology company should not be making these decisions alone. I'll leave you just with one thought, which I talked to Robin about right before we began the panel. Microsoft in the state of Washington in the United States actually sponsored some legislation, helped to craft some legislation that would restrict the use of artificial intelligence, in particular facial recognition in certain areas. That was regulation that we brought to the legislature. It did not pass, primarily because some of the public interest groups in the United States said that it didn't go far enough. We remain determined and believe that some regulation is probably better than none at all, and this, in fact, is an iterative process. We don't know everything today. So we are definitely open to regulation, and frankly, regulation that crosses international jurisdictions and has international norms is far better.
I'm going to come to our participants in a minute because we have so little time. I'm afraid all of these breakout sessions have got to back into some big plenary sessions at 1/2 the hour. So we've got to finish by 25 past latest. Can I just give you one quick follow-up, and then please have some questions ready, and that'll give me a chance to bring all of the panelists back in again on some other points. But you said that, principles before regulation. What if there are very different principles out in the world, which I think there are? I'll just put it bluntly, from a Chinese perspective, maybe some other states, the principle of states comes above those of the rights of the individual. So therefore, data works on a very particular set of approaches of principles. In America, maybe it's the rights of the market, that are that much stronger. In Europe, it's the right of the individual. So you've got three completely different I think very different sets of principles. So what do you do as Microsoft? Do you work on different principles in each market? That's pretty risky. Or do you hew to the highest norm and decide which is the highest? What are you choosing to do?
Well, you set the principles and then you decide whether or not you have an appropriate business case and principles that match before
But principles inside the company.
Yes, principles inside the company. So for example, as has been noted, we launched and announced a data center agreement here in Qatar. There was absolutely a discussion of the principles as part of that decision, and we are proud to partner with Qatar. And there are other countries where you will not see a data center located.
Right, that's an answer in itself. And Dr. Hessa, one last quick one to you on this, because you said you're absolutely focused in Qatar on shared data for public good, but really protecting personal data, protecting privacy, user rights. Where does this fit with national security? In other words, are those rights protected up to the level where they might be abused for private sector use, but ultimately is your view that the government should be able to have, any access to that data as it sees fit? Now you can speak truthfully because you're,
Since I'm no longer part of the government, I think if you will just go through even other country, you will find that there are two views. I think when it comes to human rights group, they are 100% against having backdoor to technology, where government can have access to the private information. But when it comes to the government, you will find that some of these access are very critical for, sometimes even being against specific disease. Sometimes being against, I mean, it's not always about having this data merely to invade your privacy. And I know that in the, I think that was because I always like to use fact, and I did not use it from Arab countries, so you will not say that because it is, I think just 1 minute, please. I think there are, when it comes to how governance trend seem to favor the argument that invoke national security, there are two strategies. One strategy is focused on the creation of backdoors. And Australia Assistant Access Bill 2018, they had amendment to the existing telecom legislation where they are allowing Australian government agency to apply and obtain warrant requiring technology company to allow the agency access information linked to an individual or a group. The second strategy, simply it's the outlaw the use of encrypted services, and that we know that when it comes to WhatsApp, it's encrypted services. So some countries like China banned these encrypted messages like WhatsApp, and the US, UK, and Germany have all discussed effectively banning end-to-end encryption by simply legislation that provides record all communication and to provide plain text transcript to authorities when legally required. So 100% there is, and it is becoming part of the governance. It's no longer something people even hide it. So what's my view? I think Khalid, he knows my view. My view, I really don't think that there should be any backdoor to the technology. But when it comes to security, when it comes to I think if you will see what's happening now in the world, you will always need that link. You will always need that somebody there will make sure that no other 9/11 will happen.
Thank you, thank you. Tough questions. Right, lots of hands going up. Let's get some viewpoints in. I've got 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah.
Thanks, Robin. Sinan Ülgen with EDAM in Istanbul and Carnegie Endowment. 2 very short questions, if I may. First to Mary Snapp. As Microsoft, when you're looking at the world out there, you have all these different principles in different areas, ranging from digital Geneva, AI ethics, and so on. How do you choose the state, the governments that you're going to engage with? Is that a bilateral track for you? Is it a regional track? Or is it like a global track? So what goes on at Microsoft when and how in terms of the decision of how you choose to engage which government and so on? And to Fabrizio, if you can just give us a bit of sense of where the UNGG is going, because the first version sort of stalled. There seems to be a new version now. Why it has stalled? Is there hope for the new version? And what's really the role of the UN in all of this? Is the UN being very proactive in its agenda setting or more of a backseat?
Let's pass the microphone in front.
Hi, thank you, Robin. Danish Masood from the United Nations. To Dr. El-Jaber, very quickly, can you talk, ma'am, a little bit about the ethical considerations around the genome mapping project in Qatar, what some of the challenges there were? To Mr. McGuinness, sir, my question to you is, when it comes to cybersecurity, is attribution really such a big issue, given that the Director of National Intelligence in the United States says that determining attribution for a cyber attack is near impossible, depending on the availability of the data, with accuracy and confidence, and also false flag ops, et cetera. Isn't resilience a bigger issue? And to Mary, very bluntly, sorry, how concerned are you about TikTok?
We're going to have a lot of fun keeping this in. Please, Joyce, yeah. My colleague from Chatham House.
Yeah, just follow the trend. 2 questions, very short. So just Hackme from Chatham House. First question is to Fabrizio. So since we're on the topic of global governance and challenges to that, global governance assumes a certain level of trust between the global actors. And if we're talking about states, arguably there hasn't been such a level of distrust since the Cold War. So how can we restore this trust? And what can the UN realistically play in this process? And to Mary, very quickly, you talked about the importance of principles before regulation. And last week, when we were taking part in the consultative meeting of the open-ended working group at the UN, there were calls from Microsoft for regulations, for a legal binding instrument. So does that mean that, in your opinion, the conversation on principles and on ICTs in the context of international security has matured, and now it's time for regulation? Thank you.
Hi, thank you.
It's on, yeah.
Hi, Carrie Lloyd from Columbia University. Thank you all for being here. One of the things from working in technology and in the trust and safety space I've realized is that cooperation is essential between these private companies and resulted in great advances such as the photo DNA software from Microsoft that when I worked at Twitter we used extensively combating child sexual exploitation. It's clear that collaboration needs to happen at a deeper level than simply the Global Network Initiative principles to establish a common, as you said, Mary, a common framework for what principles regulation will pursue. How can we get companies, especially on controversial issues like facial recognition, like AWS and Microsoft, to actually cooperate deeply, and how can that extend into the regulating space? Thank you.
Okay, we've got about 3 minutes left, and there was a gentleman who put his hand up right at the front very quickly. I could just take one more, because otherwise we've got like 6 questions from everyone. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Dr. Frank, security advisor to the German government, and I would like to pose a question to Dr. Hessa and maybe to Paddy as well. I'm very curious about your opinion. On one side, you mentioned the personal data and the personal rights and the personal private sector should be protected, which is completely right, but it has gone much further in the meantime, because you know about the NSO group serving the Pegasus software, for example. With Pegasus, 80% of state governments use this software to decrypt WhatsApp, crypto mails, any kind of communication. And it's not used only against terrorism or against criminal persons. The data of every person is stored in the meantime. And for another example, in the meantime, is so when a German person drives to the Swiss border, his data is 6 months security stored, for example. What is your opinion about this use of private data against the private protection? Thank you.
And so there's so many more questions, but we're going to go over time in any case, and I apologize for it being so little time. But I'm not going to use more of my words to do it. Why don't I give everyone a chance to say something? Some points were directed directly to you, but maybe starting Paddy, there were a few points on resilience you might want to pick up, and then we'll come down and finish with Dr. Hessa.
Great. So I'll try and be really crisp. So if I may, on attribution, I'm afraid to say I think that's a counsel of despair. So we're working in international law frameworks that exist. We have concepts of interventions in other states and acts of war. And we depend on the ability to say with a degree of certainty that someone has carried out an act. It is still possible to do so in cyberspace. And indeed, with the development of machine learning, enhanced machine learning, I hesitate to use the word AI, it looks likely it'll become more possible to do that. So one of the problems we have at the moment is that cyber activity is what the insurance industry would call an unpriced risk, in that there isn't actuarial data to allow you to make a judgment about the price of it. But by processing large numbers of anomalies, one gets to the point where it is priceable and one has higher certainty about what's going on. So actually, I think attribution is going to become more, not less straightforward, maybe not next year, the year after, and we need to have the international law threshold. And if I may quickly, on the question of data and availability, I thought Barack Obama was always very interesting on this when they went and talked to him about what it should be possible to do in the United States in terms of accessing data and what legislation there should be. Everyone expecting him to say, oh gosh, you mustn't be doing this. And he said, well, it seemed to him it had been a constitutional principle almost since the Constitution that there wasn't an absolute right to privacy, and that by taking particular actions, you could lose your right to privacy as long as it was properly overseen. And that seems to me to be the case. The logic of that is that the data must be available. In the United Kingdom, we have been kept safe. Terrorist acts by the people who attacked in Belgium and in France were prevented because of the storage of data. And my headline for this is, storage is not use. Yeah? So the fact your data is available is one thing. If I go and ask a question of it and draw it out, that's another. And that distinction is at the heart of maintaining our security in the digital age.
Thank you very much for those points. These are good practical answers as well. Mary.
Lots of questions for me. I will say that as we think about the principles, AI and ethics, for example, being one that we've talked about a lot, these are for the newest technologies where we have the most innovative uses and also potentially some of the highest risks. So when we think about sales around the world, we love to sell Microsoft Word and Microsoft Excel. They don't seem to rise to that level. So we have partners in sales all around the world, but as we think about some of these new emerging technologies with higher risks, that's really where these principles come to place. Some of them, I think, are at the point where we are ready for regulation. So you have probably heard us talk about the Digital Geneva Convention and the Paris Call with respect to cybersecurity and essentially protecting governments from hacks against each other and interference in elections. You've probably heard about the Christchurch Call related to social media content online. In both of these cases, we are saying that it is time for regulation, and that's probably what you're seeing in some of those UN forums, because in order to get the international collaboration and standards, you will likely need to have regulation.
Fabrizio.
No, there was a question on whether in the current international atmosphere, which is very dominated by distrust and competition over cooperation, what hope is there of making gains in this area? I think the picture is mixed. I think on the one hand, there are, as Paddy said, a number of countries who still feel that they have territory to gain in terms of deterrence or even attack before submitting themselves to international norms, and are thus very averse to international regulation. On the other hand, I think there are a growing number of smaller countries who do not have the capacity of the bigger countries, who feel extremely vulnerable and are calling out for more norms. And I think the proliferation of norms like the Christchurch Call, like the Paris Call, like various initiatives from the private sector, indicates an appetite for a greater international norm setting. But at the same time, norms that only have a certain number of states or a certain group of stakeholders signing up will always be vulnerable. And that's why we need to do more to get something truly universal through the UN. There has been some progress. The discussions of the expert group in Geneva on lethal autonomous weapons didn't go as far as the Secretary General would have liked it to go, but it made some progress in setting some principles for governing such weapons. The GGE only just started last week, but I'm told by participants that they're off to a good start. There's also in parallel an open-ended working group, which is a more inclusive process, which I'm also told has made good progress. So the signals are mixed, but I think it will take, the question is what sort of catastrophe it will take to advance. And the sad thing is that international norms tend to come into effect after devastation and people wake up. I mean, the example was cited of chemical and biological weapons after the First World War. One could cite nuclear weapons and the safeguards that were put in place after the Second World War. And of course, the Christchurch Call which would have been unthinkable, sadly, without the Christchurch attacks, is another. So I think the real question when it comes to cyber is how far the world will be able to advance, or whether it will take another catastrophe to make the world to come to its senses.
And Fabrizio, just one last point. I don't know if we had a chance to address it enough. This multi-stakeholder approach versus the let's call it multi-stakeholder approach to governance of the internet and governance of technology. Where do you see that balance playing out at the moment? Could you have two systems existing almost in parallel, or is that impossible?
No, I think the Secretary General strongly advocates for a multi-stakeholder approach, and that was the recommendation of the panel. And the follow-up we're doing through a multi-stakeholder approach. I mean, in digital, 95% of the infrastructure is in private hands. The know-how is in private hands. De facto, not by intent, but certainly by default, the private sector is assuming the role of government in terms of, for example, adopting internal policies on privacy of data when it's operating in environments where there's no state policy. So the private sector has to be at the table, and of course the civil society also has to be at the table. So of course the multi-stakeholder approach is still controversial in some circles, but I think even there's a recognition that you cannot not consult with the private sector, and it would be unwise not to consult also with civil society.
Thank you. Dr. Hessa, you have a couple of questions specifically to you, and maybe some last comment you'd like to make.
I think your ethic questions remind me of one thing very important, because we talk about the issue that is governance should look at it from privacy to a scale to one important thing, it is sustainability, and which is I know that what is happening now, governance or what we call the technology governance should encourage technology like electrical car or whatever that will reduce emission, but in the same time technological governance should also limit the externalities of a new technology. I was very surprised because I did a little bit. My daughter is advocate for environment, so she insisted that I do some research in this, and I was very surprised to find out that training of natural language processing machine, that means all those smart machines, the emission of a training model with a neural architecture is equivalent to 4 lifetimes worth of emission from the average car. And also the mining cryptocurrency or whatever, even, I mean, with the drone, with all the batteries, so 100% governance, when they should look to how they will make the disruptive technology more friendly to the environment. And I think that will be my last message. Thank you.
Okay, if that's a key message, and you can take up any of your specific questions with our speakers either after the panel, if you're going to miss the beginning of the plenaries, which are meant to be starting shortly. Just 3 quick takeaways from my point of view. This kind of a panel is always impossible, to get everything done in this amount of time, but I think it's so important to have it on the agenda. Each of you will have picked up your particular angle that is interesting to you. I think this idea that emerging economies, it's not just that they should have a voice, which we've talked about a lot, but they must be resilient, that the lack of resilience to the kind of cyber vulnerabilities in emerging economies could be a real disruptor for their economic development over time. Second, I think this private sector and civil society appetite to try to work more closely together is great, but the appetite, as much as anything, is for norms. And the norms don't strike me, as a couple of people said in our questions, as being ubiquitous right now. The principles are not there. So if the principles, my last point, are going to be hard to have globally, then perhaps, certainly for companies, maybe for civil society, it's about how governments uphold their particular principles and norms. People say they're in favor of particular things. If they don't have the judicial or transparency or accountability systems to be able to match them, then in a way no amount of statement of principles really matters. So it might be that we have to look at enforcement monitoring, verification will be as important as actually developing the systems themselves. In any case, a few takeaway thoughts that I had. Please thank the panelists and thank you all for coming.